Picture a Roman priest who couldn't touch a horse, wear a single knot in his clothing, or even spend one night outside the city walls without losing his sacred position. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore the extraordinary life of the Flamen Dialis, Jupiter's special priest who lived under more bizarre restrictions than perhaps any religious figure in history. We'll discover the dozens of strange taboos that controlled every moment of his existence, understand why these peculiar rules mattered so deeply to Roman society, and learn what this ancient office reveals about the Roman mind and their relationship with the divine. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Roman morning in 59 BCE, a young Julius Caesar made a decision that would shape history. As the newly appointed Flamen Dialis, he faced a life sentence, not to prison, but to the most restrictive religious office in Rome. He couldn't mount a horse, couldn't leave the city, couldn't pursue the military glory that ambitious Romans craved. Within weeks, Caesar found a way to escape this gilded cage, but his brief tenure illuminates one of history's most peculiar religious positions. The Flamen Dialis wasn't just any priest. He was Jupiter's living representative on Earth, the highest-ranking member of Rome's ancient Flaminate priesthood. This office predated the Republic itself, tracing its origins to the legendary king Numa Pompilius in the 8th century BCE. While other priests could balance religious duties with normal lives, the Flamen Dialis lived in a perpetual state of sacred restriction, bound by taboos so numerous and specific that they governed everything from his diet to his sleeping arrangements. To understand why a civilization as practical as Rome maintained such an impractical priesthood, we must first grasp what made the Flamen Dialis unique. Unlike modern clergy who choose their vocation, the Flamen Dialis was selected, often against his will, for lifetime service. Once invested with the office, he couldn't resign except under extraordinary circumstances. He became a living talisman, his very existence maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace between Rome and its gods. The sheer number of restrictions defies modern comprehension. Ancient sources, particularly Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century CE, catalogue dozens of prohibitions that seem to range from the deeply symbolic to the bizarrely specific. The Flamen couldn't touch or even name a dog, goat or horse. He couldn't see an army arrayed for battle. He couldn't touch raw meat or beans. He couldn't pass under a vine. He couldn't have any knots in his clothing, not in his belt, shoes, or anywhere else on his person. Let's begin with perhaps the most visible symbol of his office, the apex, a pointed leather cap that the Flamen Dialis wore at all times in public. This wasn't merely ceremonial headwear. It was a permanent fixture that marked him as sacred wherever he went. The apex featured a pointed spike of olive wood, and losing it even accidentally was a religious catastrophe, requiring extensive purification rituals. Imagine never being able to remove your hat in public, not for comfort, not for courtesy, not even to scratch your head. The restrictions on movement seem particularly onerous to modern sensibilities. The Flamen Dialis couldn't spend a single night outside Rome's sacred boundary, the Pomerium. This wasn't just inconvenient, it made any form of provincial administration or military service impossible. In a society where elite careers depended on governing distant provinces and leading armies, this restriction effectively ended any hope of conventional political advancement. The prohibition against horses strikes us as especially peculiar. In Roman society, horsemanship was a mark of social status. Equites, the equestrian class, literally means horseman. Yet the Flamen Dialis couldn't touch a horse, much less ride one. He had to walk everywhere or be carried in a special litter. Imagine the indignity of a Roman aristocrat, raised to ride from childhood, reduced to walking while his social inferiors galloped past. The taboo against knots seems almost obsessive in its comprehensiveness. Not a single knot could appear anywhere on the Flamen's person. His toga was fastened with special clasps instead of the usual tied belt. His shoes used buckles rather than laces. Even the fringes of his garments had to be carefully arranged to avoid accidental knotting. This extended to his house. No nets or snares could be brought inside. Nothing that contained knots could enter his presence. Dietary restrictions added another layer of complexity to daily life. The Flamen couldn't touch or eat beans, a staple of the Roman diet. He couldn't touch raw meat, though he could eat it once cooked. He couldn't touch or mention goats except during specific sacrifices. Wheat that had been touched by dogs was forbidden. He couldn't drink wine from vines that had been pruned with iron tools. Each meal became a potential minefield of ritual pollution. The marriage requirements for the Flamen Dialis were equally restrictive and extended to his wife, the Flaminica Dialis. He had to be married by the ancient ceremony of confareatio, a religious wedding performed with special wheat cakes in the presence of 10 witnesses. Once married, divorce was absolutely forbidden. If his wife died, the Flamen automatically lost his position, an extraordinary dependency that gave the Flaminica unusual power in a male-dominated society. The Flaminica herself lived under her own set of restrictions. She wore special ritual dress, including a dyed veil and a hairstyle that required her hair to be bound up with purple wool ribbons. She couldn't climb more than 3 steps unless they were part of a Greek staircase, a type with broader treads. She had her own religious duties, including the sacrifice of a ram to Jupiter on every market day. Together, the couple formed a religious unit that couldn't be dissolved except by death. The Flamen's house itself became a sacred space with its own peculiar requirements. His bed had to have legs made from special wood and be slightly raised from the ground. He couldn't sleep on the earth. The doorposts of his house were smeared with sacred oil, and a special fire had to burn perpetually in his hearth. If this fire went out, it was a catastrophic omen requiring major purification ceremonies. Even personal grooming came with elaborate rules. The Flamen Dialis could only have his hair cut by a free man using bronze scissors. Iron was forbidden. The cut hair couldn't be thrown away but had to be buried under a fruitful tree. His nail clippings received similar treatment. When he needed to shave, the barber had to use a bronze razor, and again the whiskers were ceremonially buried. These weren't mere eccentricities, but religious requirements with the force of divine law. Death and corpses presented absolute taboos. The Flamen couldn't enter a cemetery, attend a funeral, or even see a dead body. In a society where elite Romans were expected to deliver funeral orations for family members and attend the funerals of friends and political allies, this restriction severed normal social bonds. He couldn't even mention death directly. Euphemisms had to be employed to discuss the inevitable end of life. The prohibition against seeing armies arrayed for battle effectively excluded the Flamen from one of Rome's central cultural experiences. Military service was the foundation of Roman citizenship and political careers. Yet the Flamen couldn't witness a triumph, couldn't review troops, couldn't even accidentally glimpse soldiers in formation. He had to carefully plan his movements through the city to avoid any military displays. Work restrictions added another layer of impracticality. The Flamen Dialis couldn't perform any form of manual labour. He couldn't take an oath, which in Roman society meant he couldn't engage in most business transactions, couldn't testify in court, and couldn't hold any magistracy that required an oath of office. He existed in a strange legal limbo, simultaneously one of Rome's most prestigious citizens, yet unable to participate in normal civic life. The compensation for these restrictions came in the form of significant privileges. The Flamen Dialis held a permanent seat in the Senate, regardless of whether he had held the qualifying magistracies. He was preceded by a lictor, an official attendant, bearing the fasces that symbolized Roman authority. He had the right to have a sacrificial fire carried before him. Anyone who struck him committed sacrilege. A condemned criminal who touched him or entered his house gained temporary reprieve from execution. Historical examples illuminate how these restrictions played out in practice. The most famous case is Julius Caesar, appointed Flamen Dialis at age 13 through the influence of his uncle Marius. The appointment was clearly political, designed to prevent Caesar from pursuing a normal career. Young Caesar chafed under the restrictions, and when the dictator Sulla came to power and declared the appointment invalid, Caesar gladly shed the office and never looked back. Another illuminating case comes from 87 BCE when Lucius Cornelius Merula held the office. During the chaotic civil wars between Marius and Sulla, Merula found himself caught between factions. Rather than violate his sacred restrictions or be used as a political pawn, he committed suicide in the Temple of Jupiter. But even in death he observed proper ritual, carefully avoiding polluting the sacred space with his blood. The office sometimes sat vacant for extended periods. After Merula's suicide, no Flamen Dialis was appointed for 75 years. The Romans seemed unsure what to do with this archaic position that no qualified candidate wanted to accept. When Augustus finally revived the office, he had to modify some restrictions to make it bearable for aristocratic candidates. Even then, finding willing appointees remained challenging. The social impact of these restrictions rippled beyond the Flamen himself. His children grew up in a household where normal activities were forbidden. They couldn't have pets if those pets were on the prohibited list. Their friends couldn't visit if they wore knots in their clothing. Birthday parties, dinner invitations, normal social interactions all became complicated negotiations with ritual purity. Imagine being the son of a Flamen Dialis, unable to follow your father to the forum because he might encounter a funeral procession. Picture being his daughter, unable to wear fashionable hairstyles because they involved forbidden knots. Consider the Flaminica, unable to travel with friends to a country villa because her husband couldn't leave Rome. The entire family lived in a social bubble created by religious restrictions. The economic implications were equally significant. The Flamen couldn't engage in normal business activities because they might require oaths or involve forbidden substances. He couldn't inspect his rural estates if they lay beyond the city boundary. He couldn't invest in shipping because ships used ropes full of knots. His wealth had to be managed by agents and proxies, creating opportunities for fraud and mismanagement. Yet the Romans maintained this office for over 1,000 years, from the monarchy through the Republic and into the Empire. Why? The answer lies in Roman religious conservatism and their deep belief in the importance of maintaining ancestral customs. The Flamen Dialis represented an unbroken connection to Rome's most ancient past, a living link to the age of kings and the founding of the city. Roman religion was essentially contractual. The gods were given their due through proper ritual, and in return they protected Rome. The Flamen Dialis embodied this contract in its purest form. His restrictions weren't arbitrary, but were believed to maintain his ritual purity, keeping him in a permanent state of readiness to commune with Jupiter. Any violation might anger the god and bring disaster upon Rome. This explains why even skeptical Romans, who might privately doubt the god's existence, still supported maintaining the office. It was insurance, a hedge against divine displeasure. The cost of maintaining one restricted priest seemed small compared to the potential catastrophe of breaking an ancient covenant with Jupiter, Rome's patron deity. The taboos themselves reveal much about archaic Roman religious thought. The prohibition against knots suggests an ancient belief in binding magic. Knots could trap divine power or create magical constraints. The Flamen had to remain unbound to serve as a proper conduit between Jupiter and Rome. Similarly, the taboo against iron reflected its association with war and violence, inappropriate for Jupiter's peaceful representative. The restrictions on contact with death and corpses maintained the boundary between sacred and profane. The Flamen existed in a perpetual state of life and growth, symbolized by the requirement that his sacred fire never be extinguished. Contact with death would pollute this life force, potentially severing the connection with Jupiter and endangering Rome's divine protection. Modern scholars have proposed various interpretations of these taboos. Some see Indo-European parallels, suggesting the restrictions preserve extremely ancient religious concepts, predating Rome itself. Others interpret them through anthropological lenses, seeing patterns common to priest-kings in many cultures. Psychological interpretations focus on how the restrictions created a liminal figure, neither fully human nor divine, existing between worlds. The Flamen Dialis also served as a living calendar and weather predictor. His daily sacrifices and rituals helped mark religious festivals and agricultural seasons. His behavior was scrutinized for omens. If he stumbled, if his cap fell off, if his sacred fire dimmed, all were interpreted as divine messages. He became a walking barometer of divine favor, his every action potentially significant. The office's evolution under the empire reveals Roman adaptability within traditional frameworks. Augustus, while reviving many archaic religious offices, modified some of the Flamen's restrictions to make the position more palatable. The requirement never to see an army was relaxed slightly. The prohibition on leaving Rome was interpreted more flexibly, allowing brief absences for religious duties. Yet even with modifications, the office remained extraordinarily restrictive. Inscriptions from the imperial period show Flamines Dials still unable to pursue normal careers, still bound by most ancient taboos. The office became increasingly ceremonial, its holders often young men from ambitious families, who served briefly before finding ways to resign and pursue conventional careers. The contrast with other Roman priesthoods highlights the Flamen Dialis' unique burden. Augurs, pontiffs, and other religious officials could balance sacred duties with political careers. They performed their rituals and returned to normal life. Only the Flamen Dialis lived in constant sacred restriction, every moment governed by religious law. The position of the Flaminica Dialis deserves special attention as one of the few religious offices held by women in Rome. While Roman women were generally excluded from public religious roles, the Flaminica performed essential sacrifices and rituals. Her position gave her unusual public visibility and religious authority, though always in conjunction with her husband. The requirement that the Flamen resign if his wife died created an extraordinary interdependence. In a society where men held legal power over their wives, the Flaminica's death ended her husband's career. This gave wives unusual leverage. Roman sources hint at Flaminicae, who used their essential role to influence their husbands or gain concessions. The children of Flamines faced unique challenges and opportunities. Sons couldn't follow their fathers into the priesthood. The office wasn't hereditary, but growing up in such a restricted household might prepare them for other religious positions with fewer limitations. Daughters might find their marriage prospects affected, either enhanced by their sacred connections or limited by their unusual upbringing. The practical arrangements required to maintain the household reveal Roman ingenuity. Special servants had to be trained to avoid bringing forbidden items into the house. Cooks needed to prepare meals without banned ingredients. Doorkeepers had to screen visitors for knots in their clothing. The household became a complex organization dedicated to maintaining ritual purity. Shopping presented particular challenges. The Flamen couldn't enter many shops because they might contain forbidden items. Markets where raw meat was sold were off limits. His wife or servants had to purchase necessities, carefully checking that nothing bought would violate household taboos. Even accepting gifts became complicated. A well-meaning friend might send something that couldn't enter the sacred space. Social occasions required careful orchestration. Dinner parties at the Flaman's house meant warning guests about clothing restrictions. Attending banquets elsewhere risked encountering forbidden foods or decorations. Many Flamines probably became increasingly isolated, socializing mainly with family and the few friends willing to accommodate their restrictions. The question of enforcement adds another dimension. Who ensured the Flamen observed all his taboos? The Pontifex Maximus had general oversight, but daily compliance relied largely on the Flamen's own conscience and household vigilance. Violations might go undetected, unless they caused obvious ritual pollution. This self-policing aspect required extraordinary personal discipline. Religious scrupulosity could reach extreme levels. Some sources describe Flamines who interpreted restrictions so strictly they barely functioned. One reportedly refused to eat anything he hadn't personally seen prepared, fearing accidental contamination. Another wouldn't speak on days when certain words might be ill-omened. These extremes show how the burden of restrictions could become psychologically crushing. The office's intersection with Roman law created peculiar situations. The Flamen couldn't take oaths, but Roman legal procedure often required them. Special provisions had to be made. Sometimes his word was accepted without oath. Sometimes proxies swore on his behalf. His inability to serve as a witness or judge removed him from civic duties expected of his class. Military service, the foundation of Roman citizenship, was completely forbidden. While other priests might serve as military commanders, the Flamen Dialis couldn't even view weapons except in religious contexts. This created a strange paradox. One of Rome's highest religious officials couldn't participate in the military activities that expanded and defended the empire he served. The financial arrangements for maintaining the office reveal its importance. The Flamen received a salary from public funds, one of the few Roman priesthoods to be directly compensated. His house was maintained at state expense. The costs of his required sacrifices were covered by temple funds. This public support acknowledged that the restrictions made normal wealth-generating activities impossible. Yet wealth brought its own complications. The flamen often came from aristocratic families with extensive properties. Managing estates required travel forbidden to him. Business dealings needed oaths he couldn't swear. Investment opportunities had to be evaluated for potential ritual violations. Many flamines probably saw their family fortunes decline during their tenure. The psychological profile of men who accepted or endured this office fascinates modern observers. Some seem to have been deeply religious, finding spiritual meaning in their restrictions. Others were clearly political appointees who resented their bonds. A few appear to have developed what we might recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, finding comfort in the rigid structure of prohibitions. The office's survival into the Christian era presents a final paradox. As Rome converted to Christianity, most pagan priesthoods disappeared. Yet inscriptions show Flamine Dial is still serving in the 4th century CE, long after Jupiter's temples had closed. Perhaps the office had become so archaic, so divorced from active worship, that it posed no threat to Christian authorities. The last recorded Flamen Dialis served around 380 CE, nearly 1,100 years after the office's traditional founding. His final years must have been strange indeed, maintaining ancient taboos in a Christian empire, performing rituals for a god no longer officially worshipped, living under restrictions whose meaning was largely forgotten. What can we learn from this extraordinary office? First, it demonstrates the power of religious conservatism in maintaining practices long after their original significance faded. The Romans kept the Flamen Dialis not because they fully understood his restrictions, but because abandoning them seemed dangerous. Better to maintain burdensome traditions than risk divine anger. Second, the office shows how religion and politics intertwined in Roman society. The Flamen Dialis was simultaneously too sacred for normal political life, yet inherently political in his public role. His restrictions prevented conventional advancement while guaranteeing perpetual prominence. This tension between sacred authority and practical powerlessness runs throughout Roman history. Third, the taboos themselves open windows into archaic religious thought. Each prohibition, however bizarre to modern eyes, once carried deep symbolic meaning. The banned animals, forbidden materials, and restricted behaviors map an ancient cosmology where every action resonated with divine significance. Through the Flamen Dialis, we glimpse religious concepts predating written history. Fourth, the human dimension reminds us that religious offices are lived by real people. Behind the ritual requirements were men and women navigating daily life within extraordinary constraints. Their struggles, compromises, and occasional rebellions humanize what might otherwise seem like anthropological curiosities. The comparison with other cultures' religious restrictions proves illuminating. Many societies have created similar positions. Priest-kings who lived under elaborate taboos, sacred figures whose purity required isolation from normal life. The Flamen Dialis represents a particularly well-documented example of a nearly universal phenomenon, the sacred specialist whose power derives from separation. Modern parallels exist in unexpected places. Monastic communities with strict rules, judges who recuse themselves from conflicts of interest, even modern royalty living under behavioral constraints, all echo aspects of the Flamen situation. The balance between privilege and restriction, authority and limitation, continues to shape special positions in contemporary society. The Flamen Dialis also illustrates the cost of maintaining cultural traditions. Rome invested significant resources, financial, social, and human, in preserving this archaic office. The benefits were intangible, the burdens concrete. Yet for over a millennium, Romans judged the trade-off worthwhile. This speaks to the perceived value of continuity with the past. The gender dynamics of the office deserve final consideration. The Flaminica Dialis held one of the few public religious roles available to Roman women, yet her authority depended entirely on her husband. She gained power through marriage but lost autonomy through the same institution. Her essential role, the Flamen couldn't serve without her, gave her influence, but also made her responsible for maintaining his ritual purity. The couple's children occupied a unique position in Roman society. They grew up in the most religious household in Rome, yet couldn't inherit their parents' sacred status. They witnessed daily the costs of absolute religious commitment, yet had to find their own paths in a more secular world. Some perhaps rebelled against their constrained childhood. Others might have sought to recreate its certainties in different forms. As we conclude this exploration of the Flamen Dialis and his extraordinary restrictions, several themes deserve emphasis. First, the office demonstrates how religious systems create meaning through constraint. The very impossibility of normal life for the Flamen marked him as sacred, set apart for divine service. His restrictions weren't punishments, but privileges, signs of his unique relationship with Jupiter. Second, the position shows how societies balance innovation with tradition. Rome conquered the Mediterranean while maintaining Bronze Age religious offices. The Flamen Dialis served as a conservative anchor in a rapidly changing world, preserving archaic practices even as Roman society transformed around him. This tension between progress and preservation characterizes many successful civilizations. Third, the human stories remind us that religious offices are never merely theoretical constructs. Real people lived under these restrictions, struggled with their demands, found meaning or frustration in their bonds. Julius Caesar's escape from the Flaminate, Merula's ritual suicide, the unnamed wives who maintained impossible households, these individual experiences bring ancient religion to life. Finally, studying the Flamen Dialis challenges modern assumptions about progress and rationality. Rome dominated the ancient world while maintaining a priesthood that seems absurdly restrictive to contemporary eyes. Yet the office served important functions, religious, social, and psychological, that pure rationality might miss. Sometimes the irrational serves deep human needs for connection with the past, structure and chaos, and meaning beyond material success. The Flamen Dialis stands as one of history's most extreme examples of religious specialization. His life, bound by dozens of archaic taboos, seems almost impossibly constrained. Yet for over 1,000 years, Roman men accepted these restrictions, supported by wives who shared their burdens, maintaining an office that connected Rome to its deepest past and highest God. In our age of individual freedom and secular rationality, the Flamen Dialis seems like a relic from an incomprehensible past. Yet perhaps we can recognize in his restrictions our own bonds, to careers, to social expectations, to identities that both empower and constrain us. The Flamen's taboos were merely more visible, more ritualized than the invisible restrictions that shape every human life. As you finish this journey through the strange world of Rome's most restricted priest, consider what traditions we maintain despite their costs, what connections with the past we preserve despite their impracticality. The Flamen Dialis may be long gone, but the human impulse to create sacred spaces through separation, meaning through restriction, and identity through difference, remains very much alive. Whether we see the Flamen Dialis as a victim of superstition or a guardian of sacred tradition, his office reminds us that human societies create elaborate systems of meaning that transcend practical calculation. In his pointed cap and knotless toga, forbidden to touch a horse or leave the city, the Flamen Dialis embodied Rome's commitment to forces beyond human understanding, a commitment that helped sustain one of history's greatest civilizations for over a millennium.